And I believe I'm now recording. Okay, so let's begin. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. This is towards a panoptic view of art history. So I'm just going to read out the description of the course. My name is Xuanwei Shutu. And then through an exclusion and compression, art history contributes to the creation of mythically charged objects of art. Art history has often been regarded as a given, a discipline that defines how we interpret art in the present. This seminar will attempt to find a new purpose for art history in our contemporary moment marked by the technological flattening of all temporalities into that of the virtual present. Moderated by me, this seminar will feature 7 art historians who have made a major contribution to their field in the last 5 years. It will concentrate on their specific methodologies as a way to rethink the production of art history and historiography for the future. So that's what you all signed up for, and we're all here for that. So we have a session that begins today and then continues every week until December 15th. And one of the things that I'll be doing is asking which of the weeks you would like to kind of write a summary, and then there'll also be a kind of a respondent for that same week. So we'll do that in a little bit. But for now, maybe it's best to begin with an introduction yourselves. So maybe go around and introduce yourselves, and also maybe talk a bit about your interest in this course, and also a little bit of background about yourself, and maybe since we're all kind of meeting in this virtual space, like where you're located physically. So let's begin, if possible, in terms of like my grid of what I'm seeing. Let's begin with Andrew, if possible.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Great. Yeah, so I'm Andrew. I'm from Melbourne, Australia, where I am right now, but recently I've been living in London, where I've just completed my master's in architecture. So I guess my interest in the course, now that I've finished my studies, I'm interested in going more towards art practice maybe, but I guess I haven't had a solid understanding of that, and so of art practice and of kind of art disciplines, and this seemed like, I guess, a good opportunity to sort of engage with art history in general, but also it seemed like quite an interesting take as well. And just from the initial material, what you gave us to read, I appreciate that there's some kind of that architecture maybe plays somewhat of a role in the approaches that are being discussed as well. Yeah, that's it.
So just to recap, you trained as an architect, and is that correct? And
Correct.
You're trying to transition or move a bit more towards practicing art and also and also art history.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying to move into practicing art, and yeah. In order to do that, I thought I'd get a better understanding of the field of art history and those kind of things.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to. See if I can move on to Ellen. I have to see if I can spotlight you. There you are. So you are now large on the screen. So go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ellen. I'm originally from London, but I'm living now in Switzerland, well, between Switzerland and London. And I originally studied fine art as a bachelor degree, and then I did a master's in visual anthropology. And now I'm kind of working as a freelance visual anthropologist, both in the kind of corporate sense and also for my own practice. So it's kind of turning traditional text-based research around working with people, culture, and normally I'm making films. So yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, having finished the master's about 2 years ago, I wanted to go back to have a bit more theory complement my practice, and so that's why I decided to take the class.
Okay, great. Oh, also, also let me know if this is your first time with the new center. Maybe that's a useful thing to know. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay, thank you. Let me now move on, if I may, to Sebastian.
Hey.
Hi.
I'm from Slovenia, but I'm currently based in Frankfurt in Germany, where I'm doing my MA in curatorial and critical studies. But my previous academic background is in art history, art theory, but also in visual communication.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my interest in this course would come from a certain desire to maybe kind of like talk about different recontextualizations and restructuring of art history as discipline, but something that maybe moves a bit beyond simplistic notions of, I don't know, let's say expanding the canon, that I think sometimes really boil down to very simplistic or reductive identitarian approaches in a way. So maybe to go beyond this, yeah,
Okay.
this discourse of just kind of like expanding what we already have, but to think about different approaches as well.
But you're not for a reduction.
No.
Okay. Good. All right. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. And I'm going to move on next to Quid. Also, if I'm saying your name wrong, please let me know.
Right. So it is actually Kid.
Oh,
Love.
Kid. Okay.
Yeah. No worries. And I use they them pronouns, by the way.
Okay. Thank you.
So I am primarily. Well, first of all, I'm from Seattle, Washington. I'm I guess by day I'm a computer programmer, technologist at the University of Washington. I'm also a music producer and filmmaker, and generally a transmedia artist. And I've been taking classes most of this year through the New Center towards the Art and Curatorial Practice program.
Mm-hmm.
I have this and one other class to finish that up, and then I'll be done with that. And my interest, I don't have any formal art education background, so my interest this year has been really in kind of getting an overview and a survey of how things are, which the New Center has been pretty helpful with that. So that's about it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kid. Next up, Carl.
Yes, great. So I'm Carl. I'm originally from Sweden, although now I'm in Newcastle, England, and doing my PhD in geography. And there I'm looking at sort of a concept of geopoetics, sort of geography or the earth and the poetry, and the work of Anthony Artaud, and trying to sort of see how we can think about those things together. And as a part of all of this, I want to make a sort of series of artistic interventions. I've been painting quite a bit in the past, and so I'm sort of here to get some sort of further orientation around that part of my project, and in this seminar particularly to sort of get an idea of sort of how to think about art history in some new ways, and try to maybe think of it as practices and an object that can in some way be actionable and something we can work with, sort of. And yeah, this is my very first seminar at the New Center, so it's going to be great. I really look forward to it.
Great, yeah. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for coming first time. I'm going to move on to Nikita. Is that correct,
Hey there.
Nikita?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm based in Moscow and I work at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, where I'm kind of doing an experimental program that's conceived to work with artists and artistic and theoretical research on emerging technology and kind of newest media. And well, my general interest in this cause as well as in New Center is to better get oriented in this. And like from the reading list we had like this time, I think it might be something of interest to me for sure.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Nikita.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. And I think that's everybody, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
I'm still missing.
Oh wait, who's that? Who's speaking?
That's me, Geronimo.
Oh, Geronimo, I see you now.
Yeah,
Okay,
Geronimo.
I apologize.
No worries.
And now you are spotlighted.
Yeah.
Please continue.
So yeah, my name is Geronimo or Geronimo, however it's easier for you.
Geronimo.
Yeah, and I'm originally from Mexico City.
Mhm.
I'm currently living in Austin, Texas, where I'm going through the second year of a master's program in fine arts.
Mhm.
And my former training is in electronic music.
Mhm.
And right now I'm working primarily in the field of sound installation.
Mhm.
And my current research is based on the recoding of preconceived physical and systemic structures to create sustainable models of critical analysis that somehow respond to the economic complexities of the Anthropocene. And basically my interest of taking this course is to expand my understanding of art history and what its actual role is in like tracing the path of art.
Excellent. Thank you. So you are in Austin, Texas.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And I'm pretty sure I have all the introductions. And if I don't, please speak up. But I think we're all good. So now no longer is anyone spotlit. Let me see if I can spotlight myself. Am I spotlit for all of you or no? I am. Okay. All right, good. All right, so since you did an introduction, I'll do a more formal introduction of myself. You saw my bio when you signed up. This is a methodologies in art history course, but I'm actually an artist writer, and my work has quite a bit to do with some of the themes that are going to be approached in this seminar. Because a lot of the work that I do comes out of kind of art historical readings. So I'm certainly not trained in a specific art historical methodology, but I'll essentially be the moderator for the remaining sessions. So just today I'm going to lead a short seminar on the topic of my choice, which I felt would work fairly well towards unpacking the notion of a panoptic view of art history. The course was developed before I came on, and so I was sort of like wondering about the idea of, or the notion of the panoptic and exactly what that meant. But to me, and also through discussions, it seems to be a bit of quite or somewhat about opening up new perspectives. And so, you know, like Jeremy Bentham's and then Foucault's like appropriation of Bentham's notion of the Panopticon as a kind of all-seeing machine, typically discussed within the context of surveillance, and then the prison as a model for the Panopticon. That idea, I think, is here being used as a way of kind of opening up new modes of seeing art history, right? Which is what it sounds like most of you are interested in, right? And so what I decided to do for this session was to kind of look at art history and look at it through a very specific look at materiality and temporalities. In the description, there's something there about the flattening of temporalities into the present, and how technologies produce this effect of basically creating an ever-present present because network technologies allow a kind of like collapse where one can access the past and also kind of like bounce between the past and the future. So so the 3 readings I gave us to read kind of work through architecture. The first one's a kind of more theoretical text, now 10 years old, On the New. So there's where it's a touch upon temporality specifically, and then projecting into the future. I've also kind of looked at curatorial practice and kind of like augmentation as a trope or a theme. But before I get further, I'm not gonna, I mentioned I was gonna go a bit through my bio, but I said I was an artist, a researcher. I also teach quite a bit. So you can also see that in my bio, kind of where I've taught. And I generally teach studio art courses, usually in and around New York City. I'm based in New York City. I also teach other places. And I typically work with a collaborator, Erica Love. So most of the work that you'll see that I've made in the last 10 years has been with Erica Love, and also it's a collaborative writing project as well. Part of what I should do as well is break down the weeks before I get into my own thing. I'm just kind of looking at the list here. So if you haven't yet maybe considered or thought about who or which week you'd like to address, there's November 3rd with Judith Rodenbeck. Judith Rodenbeck's a professor at UC Riverside. Again, I'm not intimately familiar with the work of every single person, but I do know her work has to do with the politics of aesthetics, radical pedagogy, also like performance art was the first book that Judith wrote. That's November 3rd. Leo Goldsmith, November 10th. I think he works with experimental moving image media and media ecologies. I think he's a PhD candidate at NYU. On November 17th is Stephan Heidenreich. I've actually participated in a seminar with Stephan, and he deals with a variety of different topics. The one that I encountered him with was around finance and economy. So that's definitely one of his interests and how that connects to political thought. And Ty Smith, I'm not familiar with, and Clementine Dellis is December 1st. Ty Smith, November 24th. December 8th, Jeff O'Brien. And last is on December 15th, Jaleh Mansour. So if you want a bit more info about any of these individuals, please let me know. As things come in from each of these seminar leaders, I will make them available on the drive. Myself or Razvan will make that available to you, so maybe you can make a more informed decision about which of these you would like to take on. But before we end today, I'll probably be asking if there's one that you prefer to begin with. So yeah, so the topic of my seminar for today is supplements, extensions, and updates. And the description I gave you, I'll read out now. Decay, neglect, and obsolescence are risking the longevity of forms conceived only for the present. Like humans, art objects become more resilient to survive in the future. I'm sorry, let me repeat that line. Like humans, art objects must become more resilient to survive in the future. This seminar will consider a selection of historical and contemporary works of art and architecture subject to future-oriented technical transformation. Shifts in museological conservation practices will be considered alongside new computational methods, artificial intelligence, and platform infrastructures that are reshaping the production and experience of art history. So one of the technologies we'll be looking at is the museum as a technology. And so the museum is kind of the main topic of the first text that I had you read. So there were 3 texts, and there is an order to them, and hopefully you read them in that order, but I'm sure you can re-scramble the order in your own minds. So those 3 texts are Boris Groys on the New. That's from the book Art Power, published in 2008, again, 10 years old or so, a little over 10 years old. And a text by Jorge Otero Payos, Monumentaries Towards a Theory of the Apeirogon, that appeared in eFlux in 2015. And the last one is Light Repairs. And Light Repairs was a roundtable conversation around a set of artworks by Mark Rothko, the Harvard Murals, and that also was from 2015. And so that one's the one that's a bit more oriented to the future, and so that's why I wanted to have that one last. And does everyone have those readings? I should check. And so I'm going to be referring to those a little bit. So because I am new with this technology, I'll try to share my screen because I'll have maybe the text open, but I also have some slides. So so that's kind of how I'd like to approach this. So does anyone have any questions at this point? No? Okay, you're all good. Excellent. So let me see if I can do a screen share right now. So actually, just give me 1 second. I'm going to try to open up my slide presentation. And then also let me know if you can kind of like hear audio. And if you can't hear audio, because I do have a couple of audio things to play. If you can't hear audio, then I'll try to fix that. Or I'll just give you all the links and then you can pursue it on your own. All right. So I'm about to share my screen. Oh, here I can check off share computer sound. Okay. See my screen? Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because it's telling me I'm getting an audio error message. So are you all looking at a slide of Fluids by Alan Capra? Do you see that? It's like people hanging out along a structure made of ice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, about half of it, I think.
Half of it. Let me see if I can expand that. Okay, how about now?
Yeah,
Yes,
that's better.
it's more
Yeah.
centered.
Yeah, it's more centered. It's a bit bigger too.
How about now? I'm pretty much going full screen now, I think. Is that good?
I think so.
So can you see a centered image and then a quote at the top from Boris Groys?
Can't see the quote.
No. Okay, but you can see an image. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, the image is there, but not the quotes.
Okay. Okay.
So that's basically my view.
Oh yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, you can't see the quotes, but I think that's okay. So the slide that you're seeing is connected to the Boris Groys text. Had anyone read this one before? This Boris Groys text?
I haven't.
No. Boris Groys, but have you heard of Boris Groys?
I have.
Yeah. He's I mean, as far as like celebrity art historians go, I mean, I would consider him within that category, even though it's kind of a modest level of celebrity. He's Russian born, but he teaches at NYU, and his preoccupations with the avant-garde, beginning with the Soviet avant-garde, is kind of like his wheelhouse. And so this book On the New, named after this essay On the New, won a variety of awards in 2008 for its kind of reflections on temporality, and specifically the museum and kind of rethinking the role of the avant-garde after postmodernism. And so I find this to be like a relatively compelling essay, because I think it kind of throws out some really kind of interesting. It's interesting basically because of, I think, his style. He's a kind of like a sweeping theorist, where within like a paragraph he'll like make a very broad and provocative injunction, and so the first thing I kind of want to begin with is I'm going to kind of go through this from top to bottom, and so the question of On the New is kind of balance between real life and what is not real. And real life, according to Groys, is what happens outside of the museum. And so the quote I have with this slide is, it's obvious that the museum accepts only things that it takes from real life, from outside of its collections. And this explains why the artist wants to make his or her art look real and alive. So so after like the postmodern period, artists began to become preoccupied with the real and the common, and for Groys, the museum becomes the site where the common object can become exceptional because it's taken out of the flow of everyday life. And so this whole tradition, the thinking comes out of the tradition of like that we're all probably quite familiar with the ready-made. So so I kind of just wanted to frame it that way, just to start off with. And I'm gonna see if I can move forward as well. So can you see this as a new slide?
Yeah, but the text is cropped on the left side.
Oh, it is. That's really weird. Let me see if I can kind of like expand my frame. So is that better? Can you see better now?
Not really.
Yeah, I think the issue is that it's a bit too zoomed in. So if you can sort of zoom out a little bit, that might sort of help.
Okay. How about now? I really shrunk the image.
Yeah, if you drag it to the other side.
Like this side?
No, the opposite.
The other.
Ah, this side.
Yeah.
Yeah, and down a little bit, and it's going to be perfect.
So is this my sweet spot right here?
Yes, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you. This is a collaborative effort. I appreciate it. Yeah, so so let me get back to the text. So I'm going to try to kind of like look at parts of the text while I show you these slides. So, so part of what's characteristic of modernism and the modernist avant-gardes is an antipathy towards the museum generally. And this comes out of like North Atlantic kind of Western conventions of art history. So I don't know if you can see this particular quote, but this is not specifically in this text, but Caprow is used as a figure. So an American artist who worked primarily in the Los Angeles area in the 1960s and 70s, associated with performance and specifically the happenings movement. So if you haven't encountered Alan Caprow before, that's who he is. But the antipathy towards the museum as a place that he basically connected with mausolea. It's a place where things go to die, and so like if you have multiple generations, probably like by the time it's Caprow making this statement in 1967, you have like 2 to 3 generations of artists in the West and Europe who've associated the museum with a place where art goes to die. But the argument that Boris Groys makes is that all artists, and again, this is his sweeping generalization, make art intended to be framed for the museum. So the intended place for the museum, the site, the ideal site of the artwork, is inevitably the museum, because that is the only way that an artist can guarantee that the temporality of their work will move into eternity. And again, eternity, of course, is limited by the limits of the Anthropocene and also heat death and the end of the universe. But the museum is there to ensure some kind of like humanly framed notion of the eternal and preservation. So I'll read the quote. There was once an art which was conceived for the museums, and the fact that the museums look like mausolea may actually reveal to us that the attitude we've had to art in the past. It was a form of paying respect to the dead. Now I don't know much work there. I'm sorry, let me finish that. Let me read that again. Now I don't know how much work there is available from the past that has to be displayed or respected. But if we're going to talk about the works being produced in the last few years and which are to be produced in the near future, then the concept of the museum is completely irrelevant. I should like to pursue the question of the environment of the work of art. What kind of work is being done now, where it is best displayed apart from the museum or its miniature counterpart, the gallery? So if you're familiar with this art, with this history at all, you also probably know that the antipathy towards the museum, the disdain towards the museum, led to an impulse of making work that was not suited for the museum, right? But of course, the museum eventually reabsorbs whatever those attempts may be. And those attempts included land art, happenings, ephemeral art, performance, a variety of media installations, like all the things that have produced the foundation for what a lot of contemporary art is. So, the museum indelibly still becomes a kind of a barrier and a framework for thinking about work, right? It's not as if Caprow is not addressing the museum. This is from a text called "What is a Museum," right? So the museum persists as this site that is a site and anti-site at the same time. So I'm just gonna say a couple more things about the opening pages of this, and then maybe you all have some comments and observations about the text as well. I certainly want to open this up as much as possible, and also create a kind of environment where we can kind of like repeat. This is like a practice session for the rest of the sessions, where hopefully we create an environment that is open to communication. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to jump from 1967 and this period of an American/European avant-garde to the museum, the Contemporary Museum, as a site that is now adopted the same language. And not only the language is operationalized, but also through practices that emerge out of the museums themselves, the museums begin to engage what they would consider to be the real, as Groys would frame it. So the thing that what happens outside of the museum being the real, and the real is real life, and it's engagement with people. And so the role of the site known as the museum expands. It expands to accommodate this present that is the part of the mandate of this course, right? What that means is creating an infrastructure that can address a public directly, an infrastructure that can activate spaces, and it activates spaces by encouraging and programming artists that will come in and interact directly with the public, but also urging a public to speak to each other and to speak to the museum directly, right? And this is connected to expectations that audiences have now with the internet. And so, like, if you go to a contemporary museum now, it's much different than it was decades ago. And so I just want to bring that in as a point that was not addressed by Boris Groys, but one that is kind of related and I think very important, because a reminder that this text was written in 2008, and that's when I guess Web 2.0 was emerging. So like the sharing platform was a new paradigm. And so since then, the sharing platform paradigm has expanded and erupted into real life, right? So if we're making a distinction between the real and the museum as the insurer of a kind of artificial that can be preserved into the future, then that boundary has become porous. So the internet in some way has erupted into the space of real life, and it's erupted into the space inevitably of the museum. And so museums don't want to feel like they are mausoleums, because they want to get people through the gate, and they also want to get grants. So part of the slide I'm showing you, which you can see, is a photo from a Jeff Koons exhibition from a few years ago. That was taken. I took that picture on an evening when the museum decided to be open for 24 hours. So this next slide, also from around the same time, is kind of another example of a museum, in this case, the Museum of Modern Art, taking the initiative to provide museum wall space for an audience to engage directly and speak to other people and to the visiting audience, but also to speak to directly the museum administration. So this is a project called I Went to MoMA. I'm just showing you this one really quickly because I think it's indicative of transformations in the museum. So if we're talking about the museum as a site, the Contemporary Museum, this is something I'd like to highlight. So engagement activity, and this is a kind of split image. The image on the right was a technology that was brought in later with this project where these things were scanned. And these scans then became property of the museum, and the museum basically used these for advertisement. So basically, like, peer production, resources that were produced by free labor by the visiting public were then repurposed as marketing, and also to expand the kind of image of what the Contemporary Museum would like to imagine itself to be. And here's the content, again, on the museum wall. And and if we go back to the late 60s, around 1970, many of these strategies and techniques were being innovated by artists who were interested in expanding and opening up the notion of what a museum could be, right? So here's a very famous artwork by Hans Haacke. I bring this up now because a Hans Haacke retrospective just opened in New York at the New Museum. So I actually saw this piece, and in 2019, it's a bit more yellowed. And this is a piece called Momopol. So it was exhibited initially at the Museum of Modern Art. So I'm continuing with the same institution. And that was made for a landmark exhibition known as Information. And are you all familiar with this piece? Or is anybody familiar with this piece? Yeah. If you're not, it's basically a panel with a question that you see, which is designed to engage the public in a political question having to do with Governor Rockefeller, who at the time was on the board of trustees at MoMA, but was also the governor, and his family had been long connected with museum patronage. And so the question is about President Richard Nixon's Indochina policy and whether you would vote for him in November. So there were two answers you could provide, and you could provide the answer yes for the left or right for no. So you would choose, and of course, this is in no way actionable, but it presented a kind of like an object and material that would be able to collect the discursive output of a public. And so if the museum, again, for an artist like Hans Haacke, could not be a dead place, it could not be a mausoleum, it had to be a place where life would erupt into. So this is another contemporary example. So I wanted to take it to the Tate, and if you've been to the Tate, you've probably seen these touchscreen kiosks. The Tate is, I think, a very good example. This is the Tate Modern, of where millions and millions of pounds of grant money and funding, primarily through the Bloomberg Corporation. So Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, technology company, is essentially funding engagement strategies for the museum. So here you're seeing a kind of like, again, another kind of porous boundary in the museum, but one where you have a corporation that's invested in technology. And I don't know if you know, but like Bloomberg basically made its money through terminals that were used in the financial industry by traders. And so their foundational technology was basically an interface between like bankers and financial networks. And so this is them kind of extending that logic to the museum. And again, if you can read this, you can see that the level of engagement is extremely low. For instance, that woman is tapping to answer a question, my visit in 5 words. So so part of I think what happens here, and you probably are all aware of this, is that this is very widespread and dispersed, but it's also quite shallow. And this is it's no way to kind of like, it does not replace the function of the artist. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that it primarily, I think, changes the orientation between a public and an institution. And this has been happening most aggressively in the last 10 years. So I'm filling in the history that was provided in Boris Groys, because this is written over 10 years ago, with this side note, which I think is very relevant to thinking about the museum and its temporality, and a museum that insists on producing a present condition, a perpetual present, where you're always kind of engaged, and so you're always in that moment. And so the relationship of the museum to the past becomes a bit more fraught and complicated, because you're living in multiple temporalities when you're visiting this site of exception, right? When you enter through the museum doors. So I'll pause there because that's my quick intro, and also me touching on the first few pages. And I'm wondering if any of you have any comments or observations that you think are relevant, particularly to the themes of the course.
Well, I think this Hans Hacke, like it's very important to bear in mind this Hans Hacke piece at the MoMA, Paul, in relation with what recently happened with forensic architecture at the, I guess, I don't remember if it's a Whitney Museum or the New Museum. So forensic architecture is this collective that is based in London. So they were supposed to have a show at the, I think it's a Whitney, and their practice is research based, and they work around social issues. So they found out that one of the members of the trustees on the board of the Whitney was also the owner of this company that actually produced bullets that were used against migrants in the U.S.-Mexico border. So they actually didn't participate in that show. So like what I'm going with this observation is that I think nowadays the question is to what extent art is coherent with its meaning in terms of the institutions in which it participates. You know, so what I mean is like I think art should be questioning what are the bias of art institutions such as museums.
So
I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure about what your fundamental question is. Is it about?
It's more of a comment. It's not a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I was just like bringing a contemporary example of like a similar piece. Not a piece, but a similar situation that could derive from the fundamental like intentions of Hans Hacke MoMA Paul work.
And that was basically to address the political activities of a board of trustee that was outside of the patronage framework that is usually considered to be kind of like insular, and whereas like a billionaire's political activities have been traditionally seen as exterior, an externality to the way that a museum functions. Is that kind of where you're getting at?
Yeah. It would be more towards like the politics and culture.
Yeah. And this, I would agree with you. And of course, this is something that is a central debate right now around museum funding patronage, but also the role of critical activity, or the critical potential of intervening and reshaping what museums can be and will be, right? So this is kind of a central question, right? But then it's also kind of insistence on an engagement with present political conditions, and then imagining a new future, right? But maybe this is like beyond the scope of this, but I agree this is something important to keep in mind, because this is something that for those who are interested and engaged in museums and their politics, this is like the central question, right? What is the political imaginary for the future museum? And if it's not eternity, because that's what Groys brings up, then what is it? Because that eternity is also, in a sense, an illusion, or it's illusionistic. That's how Groys frames it in this essay on the new. So would anyone like to respond to that, or maybe take that comment to something that was specific within the text that resonated with you?
Well, I think in your reply to the comment, there's something interesting that I've been thinking about, and that's sort of what kind of sense of temporality is at work here, because I mean it's something very particular, and I'm not entirely sure about what it is. But I mean, it appears to me that there's this tension between the sort of museum form and the content and its contents, essentially. That's, I mean, it appears to me to be the case. There's some dialectical sort of tension between these two, and then I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out sort of what kind of, to speak in these terms of a future and of a flattening of time. Sort of what sort of do you see where I'm going? Sort of what sense of time do we sort of need to be able to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe why the reason I brought up that like the notion about forensic architecture is because that's something that Boris Groys doesn't mention in his text, and I guess that's because it was written 10 years ago, and maybe the motivations for the art making weren't as political as they are today. So I think it's like it's a way of sort of like feeling the temporally gap.
Yeah, I would say certainly that there's been a shift in the emphasis of notions of like the present, the political, because the text written in the 2000s is dealing with kind of still this this notion of the end of history, and what we are left with in the museum is a kind of opacity, like a kind of like a historical opacity, and that opacity is materialized or is objectified through the ready-made. And for him, like, the ready-made is the object that that is kind of like the important one. And there's like a variety of examples here that go from like really canonical ones, like Duchamp's Fountain, Sherry Levine, and then Fischerly and Weiss are the artists also that that he emphasizes towards the end. But before I kind of get to that, he uses like there's kind of two theoretical models. Like there's always like the Hegelian one, but here he uses, and I'm kind of looking at like the middle part of the essay after he kind of discusses Kazimir Malevich in the Black Square, and the Black Square being a kind of zeroing out, a resetting of art history, right? Because it's evacuated of all depiction and romanticism, and then of course a few years later, Duchamp creates the Fountain and the ready-made, and the ready-made takes on a whole other aspect, which is taking an object that is indistinguishable from the real, from what exists. It's mass-produced, it's pulled out of the world, and the way that this thing the only way that this thing can be identified and flagged as an artwork is that it needs to enter the museum, and there's a whole then museological apparatus that preserves the thing, produces discourse around it, and ensures that it will last decades and centuries into the future. Whereas like all other urinals, because the Fountain is a urinal, those things basically fall apart and become outdated and outmoded. And so historical time, the historical time moves forward, and then for each period that we live in, the ready-made takes on takes on a new form. And the examples given by Boris Groys really speak to that. There's photography that's used as an example, and Fischerli and Weiss are objects from their studio that look like everyday common studio objects. But then there's also the fact that the museum maintains opacity because one cannot intervene and one cannot touch the object, right? If we're talking about engagement, which I was with those examples, there is still there is still a kind of like not only a surveillance order, but there is also like a barrier where we cannot cross as a public, and we can't rip open the Fischerli and Weiss. It remains opaque as an object. We can't touch it, right? The security guard is still there, keeping us from breaking into it. So I mentioned Kierkegaard, but he does use Kierkegaard here, and he uses he uses Christ. So he goes to Judeo-Christian because, like, you know, that's what Kierkegaard, a lot of Kierkegaard's work circles around Christ, but he uses Christ as a figure because Christ is like every man, and there's no way to distinguish Christ from the God from any other common person visually, and there's no way to actually understand him as an exception and different from any of us, right? So the same thing with the ready-made. The ready-made is not exceptional in any way. It's sort of a matter of belief and kind of framing that object. So that's kind of that is kind of the central thesis. And I have kind of slides I could show you that would convey this a bit further. And maybe I'll show you those slides. But before I do, does anyone want to say anything about that part of the text? Or, well, primarily, is it convincing? Because as I said, like, and I even hold this opinion that Boris Groys tends to say things that are quite provocative without much citation or background. Nobody? Okay.
So a little bit for me, if I'm not taking up too much space in the conversation, but so I feel like he arrives at sort of Kierkegaard after he goes through the sort of Hegelian end of history, right?
Yes.
And that's sort of, I think sort of my issue with that sort of his engagement with Kierkegaard comes through sort of, you know, his engagement with sort of a historical condition that is in the end Hegelian. And I'm not sure if, I think we don't have to sort of be, you know, unconditionally critical of Hegel or anything, but I think it's important to sort of keep that in mind, that the sort of, you know, he comes to Kierkegaard after history has ended, and I just think that's a little bit sort of interesting.
Yeah, could you say a bit more about that? Like, you say interesting, but interesting is kind of an opaque term, like a ready-made. So.
Oh yeah, it's certainly. It's just something that struck me now that I sort of try to look at text again. But it's actually, I think I should sort of leave it open and see if, because I don't really know what its implications are, but I think it's sort of when we sort of try to find whenever we try to find the sort of core of someone's argument, about sort of going to a specific thinker, it's usually sort of predicated or premised on something different. And in this case, I think it's just very clear that he sort of, you say that the core of his argument is sort of, it comes to sort of Kierkegaard, but well, he really does that after he moves through a sort of very Hegelian idea and notion of history and temporality. Yeah, and I think it's very important to sort of uncover that, or sort of try to at least note it, and then we can see if where we want to go.
I think I understand what you're saying. He's still leaning on he leans on Hegel to eventually get to Kierkegaard, which is for him the big rupture. It's like the historical rupture, but it really isn't. I see what you're saying. Can you all see my slide presentation again? Is it centered? You see it okay?
No, I don't see it.
I don't see it either.
Okay. Okay, let me see. Let me try sharing again. Susie, did you join us recently? Hi.
Hi.
All right, I'm going to try to share screen again. Here I go. Let me see. How about this? I haven't tried this trick yet. How about this? Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the slides I wanted to show, just to kind of get through this a bit more methodically, is yeah, this to pick up with what Carl was saying. It's Carl, right? I'm gonna get your names wrong. Is that Carl?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Carl.
Okay, Carl. Carl, so yeah, it's Hegelian time. The art museum is just another technology that takes art out of the flow of time. Artworks taken out of the flow of time are guaranteed the illusion of eternity, but is only an illusion. And this is the death of this is the funeral of Kasner Malevich, where he's laid to rest around his artwork, and including the black square, and the black square being the prominent icon that marks for Malevich the kind of the end of historical painting. And this is and after he produces the black square, and here Rubens is used as an example a couple of times. Now I am free to do something new. Now I am free to do something new. Rather, is that it is impossible to do the old anymore. You know, and there's a lot of argument, and there's you know, this is basically the thrust of modern art history. So I won't belabor it too much. And then he shifts to the ready-made. The second slide I showed you was a ready-made, the basketball floating in the glass tank. That was a Jeff Koons piece. And here's an earlier ready-made by Jeff Koons. These are Hoover Convertibles. You may be familiar with these. So we're kind of entering into kind of like another generation of artists. Again, I'm emphasizing kind of like European and American artists, because this is what this discourse is circled around. And so if you're not familiar with these are basically just anyway, before I say what they are quite obviously vacuum cleaners, but these were new vacuum cleaners in 1981, and the body of work is known as the new, but the new quickly becomes old. And these pieces, I think, are very good examples of the argument that Royce makes, even though he does not bring up Jeff Koons explicitly, because Koons specifically frames this as the new. And of course, if we go to a museum now and witness these in these impeccable plexiglass containers lit from below with fluorescent lights, these now look like kind of kitsch items, or they look like antiques, like you're going to a design museum. But at the time, this was a way of kind of like keeping the museum from being a place where dead objects go to die, but these things are again frozen in time. So it plays with these ideas of temporality. So the art of the avant-garde is the art of an elitist thinking minority, not because it expressed some specific bourgeois taste, as Pierre Bourdieu asserted, because in a way, avant-garde art expresses no taste at all, no public taste, no personal taste, not even the taste of the artists themselves. Avant-garde art is elitist simply because it originates under a constraint to which the general public is not subjected. For the general public, all things, or at least most things, could be new because they are unknown, even if they are already collected in museums. This observation opens up the way to making the central distinction necessary to achieve a better understanding of the phenomenon of the new, that between you and other, or between you and the different. So the museum, as a site, basically allows these distinctions to play out. It produces an opacity that allows like the new to enter that space. And it's as he says, it's not elitist because it originates under constraint in which the public is not subjected, because the general public does not kind of, it's basically, I think it's still an elitist argument, because it asserts that the general public does not have access to both the discourse or the objects themselves as material objects. And for him, that's important to the longevity of the art object when it is archived in the museum. And we put the figure of Christ into the context of the divine without recognizing Christ as divine, and that is what makes him generally new. But the same can be said of the ready-mades of Duchamp. Here, we are also dealing with the difference beyond difference, now understood as a difference between the artwork and the ordinary profane object. Accordingly, we can say that Duchamp's fountain is a kind of Christ among things. And I came across this text. I came across this text around 2011, and I use it on occasion, but it kind of motivated a work that I did with my collaborator, Erica. And I'm going to show like some documentation of that work, but also still provide some quotes from that text alongside. The work I'm going to be showing you is a piece called the Tamayo Burial, which was done on the grounds of the Museo Tamayo in Mexico City. And we have somebody here from Mexico City originally, right? We got Geronimo, right?
Yeah.
So you've been to Museo Tamayo?
Yeah.
And you know the whole story of Tamayo, I'm sure.
Tamayo, the painter, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, kind of.
Yeah. So like Tamayo is like one of the most prominent modernists in the Mexican canon, right? And then he basically committed his collection of modern work and his own collection of modern work by his peers, but also Europeans and Americans. But then he also had a large collection of pre-Columbian art, which was his modernist strategy, right? It was a specifically Mexican modernism that came out of like the pre-Columbian artwork or artifacts that were part of his milieu, right? We did a work here that had to do actually with the boundary of the museum and like a close reading of this text. And so I'll just kind of still keep reading through some of these pull quotes. It is when an artwork looks like a normal thing that it requires a contextualization and the protection of the museum. This is from page 39. To be sure, the museum's safekeeping function is an important one also for traditional art that would stand out in an everyday environment, since it protects such art from physical destruction over time. So there's a notion of materiality, which was a thing I wanted to bring up, that the institution is designed to consider the future and preserve objects. We know this. The production of the new is merely a result of the shifting of the boundaries between collected items and non-collected items. The profane objects outside the collection, which is primarily a physical material operation, some objects are brought into the museum system while others are thrown out of the museum system and land, let us say, in the garbage. So, and since most mass-produced items are, because there's programmed obsolescence in most mass-produced objects that are made today, so unfortunately, most things land in the garbage. So the profane objects that constitute our environment are basically are headed for the landfill, and the museum is the place that pulls the profane object from the garbage heap of history and puts it in a place that will ensure it another temporality. So the project that I wanted to discuss was done in collaboration with an artist based in Mexico City, Eduardo Abaroa. And Eduardo made these pre-Columbian artifacts, these vessels, but he was basically making vessels that were part of the museum collection, that were given to the museum by Tamayo, the artist. And so he made these vessels out of he made these vessels basically out of clay, but we asked him to use the same mold to make one out of epoxy resin. And epoxy resin will not biodegrade. It will ostensibly last forever. And so we basically spoke to some curators at the museum, and we asked if we could take the one artifact, the pre-Columbian vessel that made in resin, and bury it outside, just outside of the museum. So it was still visible. The site where the object was to be buried was to be just outside of the museum. You could see it through this glass where it was to be buried. And there it is buried. There it is buried again. But we buried it and then covered it over, so there was no indication of where it was going to be and live forever. So the goal here was to play with this notion of the eternal, with temporalities that exist in the museum and outside it, right? The real and the illusionistic inside the museum. So that object will probably outlive the museum itself because it is not biodegradable. It's just sitting there in the ground. As you probably know, Mexico, where Mexico is now, contains many, many layers of artifacts from the Mayans, the Aztecs, and further back, right? And one thing that is known about the way that the Aztecs managed their artifacts or their valuable objects was when the conquistadors arrived, they would actually bury valuable objects to keep them from falling into the hands of the Europeans. And so that's part of what also like we were kind of operating with. We were kind of trying to repeat and add to the archaeological layering of what Mexico's ground already is, right? So so this to us, like this project, I'm bothering like showing it, and I typically wouldn't show something that we did, but this work is informed specifically by this text, or the thinking around this text, and how the museum serves as a certain boundary that defines temporality. And there it is. I'm going to just show a couple more slides because you don't get many you don't get many actual illustrations in this text. So it's good to see, I think, the objects that he's discussing. And so these are the hand carved and painted polyurethane replicas that Fischli and Weiss are known for. One of them died. I forget which one. I think it's I think David Weiss died, and Fischli is still around.
Recently?
Maybe 2 years ago.
Okay.
So through photographic documentation, you can see that this stuff just looks like the real, but it is in fact polyurethane replicas of their studio. And so this becomes an example where, you can't touch or handle these things, so they become opaque to the viewer. And here's another example of stuff that's made out of polyurethane. So meticulously made to resemble the real, but they're in fact like not the real. So if you saw these objects, let us say, in the atelier of Fischli and Weiss, you would take them in your hand and weigh them, an experience that would be impossible in a museum. It is forbidden to touch exhibited objects. To do so would be immediately alert the alarm system, the museum personnel, the police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the other example was were the ready-made objects by Sherry Levine. So a rephotographing of photographs taken in the American South during the Great Depression of tenant farmers. And these were made originally by Walker Evans. and Sherry Levine simply rephotographs them. And so it's because of technology that, of course, all this discourse is even possible. So we can now make copies by the 1980s fairly easily. And so discourses around temporality become a bit more complicated by the copy. So I think like a central essay would be Walter Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. That's like the go-to for this project and related projects when everyone was obsessed with the copy at that moment in the 80s and so on and so forth. So, and then at the end of the essay, he brings up the black box, and he brings up the temporality of the film and the screening room, and the impossibility of consuming the full duration of all time-based video or film pieces that are exhibited. And so that makes the accessibility or the opacity of the museum consistent, but consistent with now a new media form. So a form, again, technology kind of dictating the relationship to the art object. So those are all the slides I want to show you, mostly just so you could see examples of the art objects that he discusses in this piece. And that's kind of what's lacking here. It's really hard to talk and write about art if you're not even seeing the documentation of it. So, and you're welcome, of course, to look this stuff up on your own a bit more, as maybe you already have. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for the moment, and I'm going to go back to here, to all of you. And so I've kind of been talking for a while. So does anyone have any final thoughts on this essay?
I have a question.
Sure.
So you've mentioned previously the notion of the museum as a technology.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of like having difficulty in grasping what that exactly means. So maybe like my question would be like, what's the definition of technology that we're using for this idea?
Oh, it's technology in its simplest terms, which is basically a system and an operational framework.
Okay.
That's all. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Anybody else? No? It was so compelling beyond words.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I don't know. I was just going to say, in relation to the other text about monumentaries, I guess I don't have a question formulated, but it's just a thought. The temporality of these, of these objects, of the ready-made, and how exactly. The reason I bring up the other text, there's something's mentioned about, there's a quote here, that monumentary is like an expression of a contemporary editorial point of view.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, so, you know, we were talking about the Jeff Koons work or any of these ready-mades where they age in the sense that it starts to appear old. I wonder how that relates to the kind of point of view, or let's say the intent of the work, like how the temporality of the object as a distinct object relates to the message being pushed by the artist through that artwork, and what impact temporality has in that message. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure quite what that relationship is, but it seems like there might be something interesting there.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I think it's central to the formulation of the work, and I think it's a really strong observation, because that artist was quite conscious of obsolescence and quite conscious of wanting to direct that object into the specific context of the museum. And so yeah, I think that's a yeah, like I said, I think it's central to that work conceptually. But you mentioned that that object or that artwork somehow related to the other text, right? The one on monumentaries. And so you, and that was Andrew. Andrew brought up the Jorge Otero Paillo's monumentaries piece, which is written in 2015, which maybe it's a good time to transition to that, because that is kind of the next, if we're to do this sequentially, that's the next one I thought that would make sense, because I think we can kind of move from on the new to deal with temporality in a slightly different way, dealing with time as it relates to monuments and architecture. So typically monuments are erected and built outside of the museum. They tend to be in public space. But sometimes monuments simply become monuments because of longevity, because they've been around for millennia. And then the question around monumentaries is preservation. So again, it's a question of time. It's a question of subjectivity, and it's also still relatedly to the museum. It's about framing. So if we do not have the museum as a framing mechanism, a technology, then how does the monument become framed? Because as an object, it is perishable, and so we're entering a whole other field of conservation here, and we're entering the idea of trying to achieve a particular essential quality that needs to or should be preserved. And so if we've foregone, and we're not really discussing the museum as a site, but we're talking about the same desire being transposed to the monument, then how does that work? And I think I don't use this essay very much, but I thought it was really good in here because it has this neologism that I think is really good, monumentary, which is connected to documentary, which is ostensibly about an objective recording of a condition. If you think about filmmaking, but of course the documentary is always informed by the perspective of the documentarian. So you always get a kind of showing of the creator's hand. You always have a style that's exhibited. And because of that artifice that is part of the delivery, that artifice, according to the author, basically puts the real into relief, or the genuine, the authentic, right? By framing it through a kind of artifice. The real becomes more evident, right? And I think it becomes like the museum. The museum is a framework that allows the real to be looked at in authentic terms, or more authentic terms, at least the way that a viewer potentially processes that content, which is which is historical in some way. So so that's kind of that's what I have to say in terms of a transition from the Groys text to the text on monumentaries. Does anyone have any comments on that text, or how it fits into a kind of rethinking of art history, or the role of agents who are tasked with like framing art history or new kinds of histories? I can tolerate some awkward silence. It's cool. We don't always have to be performing at all times. So if you need to gather your thoughts, or just take a sip of water, I'll do that. Just go ahead.
I guess one thing I could say is just I found it Well, I think what's interesting about it is that it places the new, like this, let's say the editorial perspective and the genuine, or the editorial perspective and newness is, and some, you know, they're connected here. So the new and the genuine or the old in this relationship. Yeah, it's that just seems to be an interesting way to think about it, that these are in constant dialogue, let's say. And yeah, that seems like a nice framing of art history. Maybe that's an obvious thing, but yeah, just I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah, and there were a couple of examples in there, and I don't necessarily want to talk about the example of like the replica of a Roman theater, but I think it should be noted that the design for that Roman theater was conceived in the 80s and then executed and finished in 93. And that was in Spain. And so basically it's a framing of these ancient Roman stones at a Roman theater. And so it being that period, this is like the heyday of postmodern architecture, where like one of the key features of postmodern architecture is basically a collapse of history into a single structure, into a single design, where you know, you could basically mix and match and take from different periods, and you get a kind of pastiche object or pastiche structure made of different things. And so that's part of what was being here, like the artifice of what was built was foregrounded, and through that foregrounding, it made the obviousness of the artifact even more so, because you know, you could have, because there was such a contrast architecturally between the two main elements of that reconstruction of Roman theater.
I guess for me, what this article really tried to do is to kind of like, if we look at a pastiche, as you named it, to go beyond certain polar opposites or dichotomies that are involved in this pastiche, such as the notions of authenticity or non-authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So like kind of like to look beyond that, and not fetishize something just because it's considered monolithic or stable or canonical. But yeah.
And he insists that, like, just to pick up with what you're saying, the author insists on that viewers tend to arrive at objects like this with a kind of binary thinking, and this is like his framework, is that like the relief, like the distinction between the authentic and non-authentic is very strong in this kind of binary model, and he feels that this is like quite effective in conveying like what you just said. But as far as like authenticity, because that was something that has just been said, is the authentic is always going to be in some way a simulation of a particular moment, and so this is once again a technological question, right? If there are limits to being able to reproduce and copy the original, then with those limits, then with the case of monumentaries, artifice enters the oh, my internet. Are you guys seeing me? I got my internet connection's unstable. Do you still hear me?
Your connection's very bad.
It is?
Yeah.
Let me see if I can fix that. How about now? Oh, you know what? Let me switch. I might dip out for a second. How about now? Do I look sharp?
Yes.
Do I
Yeah,
look
thanks.
authentic?
Yes.
Good. See, that was planned. So that was like that was the incursion of artifice, because I wasn't a perfect virtual rendering of myself. But yeah, if there's kind of a lack, if the technology for reproducibility cannot achieve a perfect copy, right? You can't like bridge that uncanniness. That's where the monumentary becomes significant, right? Because I mean, this is like media ecology, media theory. It's like it has quite a bit to do with like the tools and technology one has available, and how those limits, in some senses, become strengths, because that allows you to kind of like shape a narrative or a story, or in this case, architecture, in such a way that that binary or that distinction creates that difference beyond difference, renders a kind of an engagement with what may be the authentic, right? So I just wanted to bring up notions of the virtual and mechanical reproduction or virtual reproduction in this, and how the postmodern period was a period that was the first real close, like modernism for sure, but then postmodernism engaging with the notions of like the artificial and such, and also the virtual, because that's when the era of digital technology emerged, and that potential became very clear culturally. So does it, any other point, does anyone else want to say anything about that particular text? For me, that was a bit of a bridge text between the two.
I think I was just going to say, for me, what I found interesting was the fact that, at least within the architectural sense, and at least from what I gathered from this text, there's kind of no controversy about trying to restore or trying to add a supplement to architecture, essentially. Like, you know, he talks about almost like neglect with I think it was the Mayan ruins or something that were destroyed. Whereas I feel like in the artistic sense, whilst most of the time you are trying to conserve and you are trying to work to preserve something and, you know, keep it in the museum, there are also artists who don't want that to happen and are really quite happy to see, you know, the demise of their piece and it play out. And I feel like you don't really get that in architecture sense. It's more sort of termed as their neglect. And for me, I don't know, it's just,
yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, it's a very good observation. I think that may have to do with like the functional nature of architecture, as opposed to the non-functionality of the art object. So yeah, that's a clear and important distinction to make. And there's also, I think, part of like, and this hasn't been brought up yet, part of the idea of authenticity has to do with the intention of the artist, and maintaining, if there is an intention by that artist, if that is articulated, if that's articulated and recorded and archived, then that is what should be maintained over time, if it's at all possible, and if that is also the goal of a museum, right? Yeah. Because that's only really, I mean, that's the whole field of art history, is to kind of come to terms with some of these with some of these questions. But it was only like because of, like, with modernism, that you have the emergence of the artist as a figure, and a certain like subjective intentionality that was articulated and needed to be maintained and central to the creation of the work. So these things are all very historically embedded, and so the monumentaries text was dealing with like Roman and ancient architecture, where these questions are kind of more open, right? So then that leaves space for the contemporary architect or designer to intervene, where with contemporary work, intervention's a little bit more difficult, because there's a greater emphasis on on intention, but also, but basically the whole framework is already pre-established because there's so much discourse around the emergence of a work. And again, that's the thing about the present. The present kind of produces a whole framework around a piece or an articulation that is important to note. And yeah, so that's really important, is how the examples in that text were millennia old and not at all dealing with contemporary art. But if we apply the notion of the monumentary to the present, I think then it gets kind of interesting. And that's what the third text was about. And so again, this is a little bit of a bridge to the third text. So if you does anyone else have anything to say about this text? And no one had anyone read this one before? Nobody? Yeah, it's like a lesser known text, but I think like it's really a kind of effective, and it brings up like an important bridge to the third one, and that was a text that appeared in Art Forum in 2015. That text is Light Repairs. I'll read you the full title. Light Repairs, a roundtable to the restoration of Mark Rothko's Harvard murals by a number of art adjacent people and artists. So I'm gonna go, let me just fix the view here, because I don't know if anybody wants to be highlighted. Let me see if I can just go back to there, the non-hierarchical view. Am I big on your screen, or is Sebastian still big? Sebastian big?
You're big.
I'm big, okay. All right, well, as non-hierarchical as I can get. So, so the people who are involved in this roundtable discussion, you may recognize some of the names. Yves Alambois, esteemed art historian, Harry Cooper, curator, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, I guess she would be considered a new media artist, Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, basically like a conservationist, but not just simply a conservationist, but somebody who has been working on conserving the work of American modern, abstract modern artists like Rothko and Barnett Newman, others. Ken Okishi, a relatively young artist, works with technology. R.H. Quaitman's a painter. David Reed, painter. Jeffrey Weiss, art historian, and Michelle Kuo was at the time the editor of Art Forum back in 2015. So this is not the most, it wasn't like, for me, it's not the most pleasant piece to read, because there's a lot of like hand wringing about like everyone worrying about like a bunch of Rothko paintings. But I think within like these relatively kind of conservative observations and concerns, I think a lot of like pretty interesting points were brought up, because you have a modern artist, and some of the people in this roundtable had actually known this person, and this person had articulated precisely how the work was to be exhibited. Yet there is still a big debate when a new technological paradigm emerges, and that paradigm then allows for a new kind of supplement. It allows for basically a hybrid work to emerge, where you have the material object, the painting, which has been decayed and diminished and no longer authentic based on how it was originally conceived. And then you have this the supplement, which is digital, which is based on light, and that creates something that's a bit more like an installation work, the final effect of the work. And one last thing I wanted to say about what's interesting, I think, for me about this particular issue, this event around Rothko, is that the paintings themselves, if you know like the history around Mark Rothko and his work, the goal of the work was to with the painting to actually produce the effect of light. to produce the kind of like a phenomena that in the painting, the way you perceive the painting, that that you could not in any way identify or quantify. It was a kind of phenomenological experience, right? So the notion that that through this process that was discussed in the article, that through quanta, that through data, an approximation, a close enough approximation could be to produce the effect of a Rothko is really, I think, like really interesting. And that effect being done with light, and light as a supplement to the painting. So does anybody want to chime in here and maybe talk about, well, first of all, who had anyone heard of this event? Yeah, one person, and that was Susie. Only Susie, only me and Susie. Susie, did you see it in person? No? I can't hear you.
I haven't seen it in person. I just remember reading about it when it first took place.
Yeah.
So yeah, I found this text really interesting to see this kind of back and forth of ideas about what this means and what this sort of confluence of media means. And I wonder, I think it would have been interesting to know what these conversations were before, like prior to the process taking place itself, and who these conversations were had with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know anything about the history of how this like came to happen in the first place.
I know a little bit, and I can fill you in, but Susie, since you arrived late, would you mind filling us in on who you are and why you're here, if you don't mind? I know it's kind of weird to like insert it now, but
yeah, no, sorry about that. I had some technical issues.
Oh, so did I.
Yeah, I'm Susie. I'm based in Lima, in Peru. I am the director of an MFA program, a Trans Art Institute, and I run an arts organization in Peru, working in remote, difficult to access locations. And I also work as an editor. So that's kind of my background. And I'm partly doing working here in the new center because I'm sort of trying out a collective study group here in Lima where I'm outlouting my research at the new center with a group here.
Okay.
So I might be feeding back some conversations from that group into this as the weeks progress.
Okay, yeah, great. These are being recorded, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So background on the Rothko murals. Well, part of it is in the text where the murals entered storage. Well, the murals entered storage in 1979, but they were commissioned basically for basically like a cafeteria at Harvard. And I should say that I did see this exhibition. I went to the exhibition as soon as I heard about it, and tried to actually like think of a project addressing it. I really invested, my collaborator and I really invested in it, but nothing really came of it except a lot of research and spending time with the work. So yeah, these were put on display in the 1960s and 1970s in a cafeteria. The cafeteria was, I think, on the 12th or 13th floor of a building, beautiful view. So the Rothko's hope was that the blinds would be closed, and so no light would enter and therefore not damage the work. The blinds are open, the work was damaged. There were 6 total pieces. 5 were displayed in the cafeteria. 1 was kept in storage. Therefore, it was still preserved very close to what the original was like. And so that one piece was used as a reference for the scientists who then had to recreate the Harvard Rothko murals in this exhibition that was in 2015. So that's a bit of the background. And so the a lot of the technologists were I think it was a mix of technologists who were working at Harvard, and I forget what other institution. Not Harvard, I'm sorry, but at MIT. So they were all in Cambridge, and so the research was done in collaboration with Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, who is the chief conservationist who works at the Harvard Museums, formerly known as the Sackler Galleries, where they were shown. But the Harvard Museum, but also she splits duty there with the Whitney Museum in New York. So she works between both. And she also was behind the restoration of the Rothko murals, not the Rothko murals, the Rothko paintings at the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas. So she's deep in Rothko. She was used she performed her regular duties as a conservationist, as an advisor, so that the virtuality of the rendering would match the reality that she would conceive of as being accurate. That's like, I mean, there's more background, but I'll leave it at that. But I could show you some slides, which maybe will help. Of course, these are visual things, and the PDF I gave you did not have the best quality images. So I'll just open this up again, and I'll share the screen. And let me see. Is everyone seeing it? Okay, can you all see it? Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is what you saw when you entered the gallery on the wall. There was also a schematic which provided the process, because part of demystifying a Rothko is demystifying the technological process. So the part of the process was like scanning original Ektachrome slides of the documentation of those paintings when they're first made, but also factoring in how Ektachrome slides age when then trying to fill in the overall and differential fading of the painting. And what you see there is like the 5, 6, and 7 are basically the light projecting onto the paintings in the exhibition. So when you entered the exhibition, it was a fairly dim lit room. The only real light was light coming from projectors. There was actually maybe a bit of room light to help illuminate the paintings. And this is not the best slide, but these were the conditions of the room. This is during the setup of the exhibition. Here's more. Well, that's not it. And when these galleries were built, they were built alongside like a state-of-the-art conservation facility. So like right in the same building. And this is one of the first exhibitions at this museum at Harvard. This conservation facility was designed. So that was part of the emphasis of that institution was conservation. So I'm going to go back to the slide, this one that has a quote from the text. Ken Okishi is a media artist, and on page 295, his comment was that one thing that I mistyped, that I had trouble with, is precisely this reduction of colors to numbers. There's the kind of color change. I did a copy and paste of a PDF, which is always a bad idea. Color change is produced in a painting on the one hand, and the kind of color that's produced in a digital image on the other. The digital is in its basic form a reduction of a painting to a series of numbers. So this is kind of echoing what I said earlier, where the supplement is always going to be, when digital based on a series of numbers, is based on a matrix. And and as far as what happened in the gallery being time-based, and because there were two primary elements, and you may remember reading about this, was that from the time that the exhibition opened until 4 p.m., you would get the hybrid work, the projected supplement on top of the faded painting. But at 4 p.m., a guard would come through and turn off all of the projectors, and so you would get to see the actual faded work, and it ended up feeling very theatrical because it was announced, and they would happen one by one. All 5 would sequentially be, the light would be turned off, and you also may remember in the text that you could hear people audibly go ooh and ah. So it was kind of turning this like act of conservation, like the reversal of the act of conservation, into a spectacle, and that was part of how the museum like engaged the public. So you got to see both sides of the process, right? You got to see the supplement, and then you got to see it without the supplement. So yeah, that was at least my experience with it, and so I don't know if, now that you know a bit more, does anyone have? And I'm going to actually close the sharing and go back to this view. And since nobody had really heard of this, and this is like your first encounter, what is your in terms of temporality and in terms of like conservation and everything that we've been discussing, what is your take on this? Because there are notions of authenticity, but there are also ethics, and there also is a certain privileging of where this technology gets applied. And so there's a number of things that could be discussed, I think.
So if you allow me,
Absolutely.
So to go back to sort of my initial question, sort of, I still don't really, and I think maybe that's what we're getting at here. Sort of, I don't really get what we mean when we sort of predicate a temporality of an object.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that very much has to do with this, because like in all of these texts, we have seen sort of a different kind of, technological supplement or a technological framing that in some way not only sort of impacts or intervenes in what is possible for a particular object, but also for sort of how we view what time is, perhaps in a sense, and sort of how time can come to pass in relationship to an object. So I think there are these two sort of things that go hand in hand here. It's sort of both concerning what happens to the object and also what happens to our idea of time as it regards an object.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's also something very political about this, because I mean, who gets to determine which sort of possible trajectory becomes, actualized essentially, and how it actually ends up transpiring. And I think it sort of in the art form discussion, I think it sort of that became quite evident with sort of, I think it was Jeffrey Weiss who was sort of entertaining, sort of just leaving it and letting it go to waste.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and at this point, it's sort of how do we apply different sort of framings, and then there are sort of other questions, I guess, sort of with wider sort of repercussions. How do different technologies of temporality or different sort of supplements and sort of changing temporalities around, how do they sort of impact in a wider experience of time? That's a lot now, but I just sort of had all of these things in my mind. So yeah, maybe someone can sort of continue.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Does anyone else want to respond to that? Because my job is to kind of do that, but but there was a lot. There's a lot there.
So this is Kid. I haven't talked, so I'll say something here. But I think the interesting thing, speaking to the temporality of it, is that specifically with the Rothko, is that the discussion in some of the papers about the real versus the unreal, living versus the museum as kind of a fixing in time or making it eternal. Right, you have these paintings which were basically commissioned and purposefully made for display in kind of a pseudo gallery setting of a cafeteria, and then repurposed essentially to repurpose for the museum space, right? So these were artworks that were made and were essentially living in a space for a period of time, and in doing so were degraded naturally as the living thing progresses. And at the point of being moved into museum space, were then it seems like the decision was made of, are you trying to basically make eternal the current condition, or are we trying to basically reproduce the original artwork for the space, right? And so the juxtaposition of those two things is very interesting, but it does, I think, it brings to bear the temporality of when within the life cycle of a work of art it is brought into the museum, right? If it's a new art that's newly created that is either commissioned or brought immediately into the museum, it's a different thing than an artwork that has existed in a separate setting for 10, 20, 100 years and then brought into the museum space, right?
Yeah. That's a very good observation, because I think that also speaks to what Carl brought up, is like, who gets to decide if the pursuit is to the authentic, right? Because an authentic recreation based on context would require the recreation of the entire cafeteria and the intention of the artist to have them exist in that space. Particularly if you are a historian of Rothko, like the Rothko Chapel is quite specific in the context of the Rothko Chapel is specifically designed for those works, that sequence of work. And the other sequence, the third sequence that Rothko made in his lifetime, was for the Seagram building in New York City. That was for a restaurant, actually, another place you eat. But I watched a video once where an actor playing Rothko, and I don't know if this is true or based on an anecdote, but he noticed all of the like the fat cat rich like people eating at this 4-star restaurant, and then he insisted that his paintings be taken down and put into a museum. So like there's only then 2 series that were available to the public for a while. Actually, the Tate ended up showing the Rothkos that used to be in the Seagram building restaurant. But the whole point of me doing this long tangent is because I wanted to just just keep going with what Kid was saying, and saying context is super important. And that wasn't the case here. What happened was, like, everyone got really myopically attracted to the materiality, to the objective materiality of these paintings, and then try to reproduce a phenomenological effect that was divorced from context. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say about that.
I think there's also something interesting here about this, where the focus of the question of authenticity is, because from this description of them switching the lights out, switching the projection off at some point during the day, it almost feels like there's an attempt to make the conservation process the focus of authenticity, rather than the work of art itself. They're trying to make the experience of the conservation the authentic experience rather than the experience of the work being an authentic experience.
Yeah, yeah.
That's something that I hadn't come across before, that strange kind of confluence.
Yeah, it's a kind of, it's enabling a new kind of like production coming from us, basically adding a kind of like agency to the role of a conservationist in a way that never existed before, right? Because the goal is to achieve a certain authenticity. But again, like technology opens up these new possibilities, and then we all need to deal with like the ethics and the direction for these new forms. So that's part of like, yeah, like the consideration here and in this question. And there are myriad other examples of artworks that stand to be reproduced and made virtual again, particularly with conflicts like in the Middle East, where there's a destruction of objects and entire cities, like in Syria. And so, like, what does one do? And there are artists who have pursued the recreation of some of these artifacts. I won't get into today; there's just not enough time. But there's a whole area of exploration within this field that where the expanded role of the conservator actually can be appropriated by artists who maybe want to contend with these same questions and activate objects in a way that was not previously possible. Does anyone else want to say, what time are we supposed to go until? I know we started late, but are we, how are we on time? I apologize, I haven't been checking. Are we supposed to go to one? I'm on Eastern Standard Time. I thought it was 1:30. For me? I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have maybe 10 more minutes, and then I also within the 10 minutes, I just wanted to also ask you if you've thought about which day you would want to respond and write a summary about the readings. But before that, and I'll leave 5 minutes for that. And I can go actually a little bit longer because we did start late, maybe like, and you're welcome to exit, of course, if you have places to be or want to go to sleep. So let me do a quick share again of the PowerPoint here. Okay. If you want to pursue this further, and I can add this information to the shared drive or put it in the chat section, because that also gets archived, is that there is another example with the Rothkos I mentioned that were originally at the Seagram building. They became subject to vandalism in 2012. Here's the example of it. So a gallery was specifically built to show these. Somebody went up to them with a marker and wrote this graffito. And if you're interested in materiality and understanding the essence of like how these people pursue the essence, the material essence of a thing that's supposed to be ephemeral and the effect to be non-quantifiable, there's a bunch of really interesting videos about the restoration of Rothko's Black on Maroon. That's the name of the painting. That was done by the conservators at the Tate, and they used a lot of optical technology, and it took over a year and a half to actually extract the ink and then touch it up to get it to be like the original again. So yeah, so you can look that up if you'd like. And another interesting topic that is related is my internet okay? I got a warning again that it wasn't okay. Can you still see this? Can you still see the slide? Yeah. As you may want, there's there's a really easy read by in the New Yorker, and I'll include this as well. It's around a question of conservation as well, and it has to do with technology, which is with 3D scanning, the level of resolution is so high that there are not printing processes that can produce all of the detail. So there is a resolution gap. And then that's like another question in terms of like authenticity and time. And the artist Josh Klein has done interviews with the conservator from our article, Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, that states that in the future, if a 3D printing technology is available to render these pieces he made, which were scans of custodians that were working at some high-end, I forget the high-end hotel on the High Line in New York, but these are custodians he interviewed, and he scanned their bodies and then put their body parts on these carts, these ready-made carts. But the scans, of course, were limited to what he was able to access as far as 3D printing technology. So this is kind of another area to pursue if you're interested. And this piece is written by the author Ben Lerner. It's a pretty good read if you do want to pursue it. I had some other stuff, but maybe I just leave, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit back to between the second and the third articles. And as far as supplements go and monumentaries, what I'd like to also bring up and leave us with is that in terms of his historical revision or reconsidering monuments, is at least in the United States and certainly other places, there are ongoing debates and very like aggressive. Well, there's politics that are circling around monuments of usually monuments that depict people who are on the wrong side of history. So the American Civil War being a big divide. And so you have monuments that are being taken down overnight and removed. In New York, for instance, there's a statue of Theodore Roosevelt, who founded the Natural History Museum. This is in front of the Natural History Museum. And on Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day, there's been protests over the last, I believe, 4 or 5 years now. And in terms of adding a supplement to this painting, and this, I'm sorry, painting, it's a sculpture. It depicts Theodore Roosevelt on a horse, and then an indigenous person, basically a servant at his side. And there's a whole, of course, like history of like white settler colonialism around it that's problematic, and that's what the desire is to reconsider a new monument that is a more objective depiction of what actually happened in the United States in the early 20th century. But these are images of the protests that are led by a group known as Decolonize This Place, which you may be familiar with. And here is an image of them draping a cover over the statue. So rendering the figurative sculpture an abstraction, basically doing a Christo to it, just putting a blanket, a cover on it. And then in 2017, there was red liquid that was splattered on the sculpture and on the base of the sculpture. That was cleaned up. I don't know who cleaned it up, but yeah, I did want to open that up as also another direction of this conversation around monumentaries, where basically it's not where there are reconsiderations of the role of monuments and there being an open question as to what is to be done. And this one is not based necessarily on technology, but one based on politics in a particular moment, in our particular moment. So does anyone want to say anything about any of these? Like, I think I brought up like 2 more things, because we could end with that if you have any feelings about that. Again, I open up a can of worms, and you could have a whole seminar about just these things for sure. But if anyone does anyone have a hot take on it? Because it's going to be hot, I know. Sounds, that's cool if you don't, because you probably want to wrap up. Okay.
Maybe I can just chime in just for a minute.
Yeah, go for it.
I was thinking about, so with the monumentalities, I was thinking about the idea that by having this editorial perspective, placing like the new elements in correlation to the old, that I guess one thing that does is, you could say it does, is it almost, having the new and the old, it makes the old elements seem almost more authentic than it actually is, in a sense, because you have the new thing in comparison. And I found that interesting, and the idea that, you know, an alternative conservation approach would be to kind of consistently plaster over everything and have it look, you know, as it was, let's say, whatever that means, but doing so with the assumption that everyone takes for granted the fact that there is no genuine authenticity, therefore, you know, which is quite a different approach. But then I think it's interesting to connect that idea to what you just brought up about the monuments, because it doesn't, that thought doesn't work so much there, in the sense that I think it becomes much more important. I mean, maybe there's political things involved. It becomes much more important to have, there's like a necessity of an editorial perspective with these monuments, with these, so rather than plastering over, and yeah, it becomes very essential that we actually have a commentary there.
Absolutely, yeah. And whether there's a kind of, you'll never reach a kind of consensus, of course, on public sculpture. No one ever has. And that's one extreme, a kind of like a consensus object that's represented, that's accurately representative and depicting. So again, the authenticity as an impossible, a kind of like utopian thing that's not ever reachable. And then on the other side, and I'll conclude with this, is we're already living in a condition that's augmented by technology, supplemented by technology, where we all have our own filter bubbles already. And if we then consider maybe like augmented reality, where we're already kind of being fed like a certain bubble, a certain framework on platformed media, but augmented reality as a way of kind of just holding up your device and seeing reality through a screen, mediated through a screen. So like my statue could be like unique to me, and everyone else could have their own particular variation of that artwork or that object based on how your interests have been mined and processed by the digital overlords of social media, etc. So that's another thing to consider, is that we're already like operating in a kind of like fragmented condition where we're already kind of like seeing a very specific version of reality, and that can be, of course, translated visually now with technology. So those are the two poles, right, in terms of supplements. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe that'll be a great place then to continue the conversation with the other folks who will be leading seminars. So last thing I'm going to ask is, I'm going to go through the weeks, and I'm going to name out the seminar leaders, and just say if you know for sure that you would like to respond to that person. So November 3rd, Judith Rodenbeck. That would be next week. Anyone interested in Judith? I definitely need to get somebody for Judith today because that's next week.
Yeah, I have a lot going forward in the following week, so I could do that.
Okay, so Carl.
Yeah, thanks.
So Carl will be doing Judith. Okay, and
I'm interested in the economy and finance person you mentioned.
Stephan Heidenreich. I don't know if that's what he's going to be covering specifically, but I'm sure that'll be part of it. So you want
And
to
when is that happening? Just
November 17th. So
yeah, I can do that.
Geronimo, you want to do Stephan? Okay. So I have to backtrack. November 10th, Leo Goldsmith. Experimental moving image media documentary, media ecologies, digital culture. It's like cinema film studies kind of person.
I can do that one.
All right, kid. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you are tasked with Leo Goldsmith and Clementine Dellis, curator and curator, anthropology and history of theory. Anybody?
I can do it. I don't know the person, but sure.
Okay, so that'll be Ellen. Ellen has Clementine Dellis, and we have two more. Jeff O'Brien. He also he's an art historian and curator. He's dealing mostly with contemporary Arab art and the art of the Middle East. So, anybody interested in that? Interested in Jeff O'Brien? We still have Andrew, Sebastian, and Susie.
Yeah, this Andrew. If you can put me down for Stephan as well, that would be great.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I still do need somebody for Jeff O'Brien and then Jaleh Mansour.
Can I do Jaleh Mansour?
Okay. Okay, so the two of you?
Sure.
So Susie and Sebastian, is that right? Who said?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That was me, yeah.
Okay. And that's everybody, but we still don't have somebody to respond to Jeff O'Brien on December 8th. And I think, did I get everyone? Everyone is now assigned to somebody? One, two.
Well, I'm not actually, but well, I guess I could do it for Jeff, I think.
Okay. Would you mind taking one for the team?
Sorry? Yeah,
no.
I'm cool with that.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Nikita. So Andrew assigned to Stephan, Ellen assigned to Clementine, Sebastian Jaleh Mansour, Kid Leo Goldsmith, Carl Judith for next week, Nikita Jeff O'Brien, Geronimo Stephan Heidenreich, and then Susie Jaleh Mansour. So that's good. I guess if we need any more information, myself or Razvan will be in touch. This concludes our first session. Thank you for joining. Hopefully it will lead to really great conversations in the coming weeks. And in the coming weeks, I'll simply be your faithful moderator and not be leading seminars. So again, any questions, please reach out. Otherwise, have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thanks.
See you
Thank
guys.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.